So today, 22 of July, summer is flying by and a beautiful day out, but I wanted to quickly touch on with a video some of the things that I was remarking on Twitter with regard to corruption and sort of the crossing of the wires, metaphorically, with the Anchorage Museum, a nonprofit which is publicly owned by the municipality of Anchorage, and the crossing of the wires with that thing, and then the for-profit Anchorage Daily News, which is a newspaper which has been bankrupt recently, changed hands recently, and doesn't have the best reputation. A lot of the staff and former and current, even seem to be complaining about lack of transparency with salaries and management issues there. And a year or two ago, they entered into this somewhat controversial partnership with ProPublica, which is a nonprofit as well. So I saw that parallel, and I remarked on it with how the nonprofits ProPublica and the Anchorage Museum, respectively, have engaged in partnerships with this for-profit newspaper, the Anchorage Daily News in Alaska, and how on ProPublica's hand of things, there is mission alignment, in terms of contemporary journalism, in terms of ProPublica working to finance, investigatory journalism, but Anchorage Museum doesn't really have that in terms of their mission statement and in terms of, the way that their organization is structured. So they're sort of going above and beyond, I guess someone could remark, when they're doing this partnership that is I'm focusing on with Julia O'Malley, where she's doing this quote-unquote neighbor series. But obviously, like we've said several times, is why Julia and why Anchorage Daily News? Did the museum open those opportunities that they wanted to do something like that? Did they open that to other newspapers and to other people besides Julia? Sort of like how we remarked with the museum's partnership with Julia and her book, The Whale and the Cupcake, and how it was a misappropriation of funds, and how they seem to be exclusively working with Julia at the expense of providing that type of an opportunity to others and to other writers in Alaska. But now also, when we're looking at the partnership with Anchorage Daily News to other newspapers in Alaska as well. Why are they just working with Anchorage Daily News? What is the metric and policy by the museum that supports this type of thing, if that makes sense, and how that sort of undermines their nonprofit status is essentially what we're getting at. And a couple other things we sort of touched on, or I touched on, were basically the issues with the executive director of the Anchorage Museum, Julie Decker. Prior to the partnership with Julia O'Malley, she has published a couple books, co-published with University of Washington Press, the same sort of business relationship that the museum did with University of Washington Press to co-publish Julia O'Malley's book, The Whale and the Cupcake. So there is a little bit of a precedent with the Anchorage Museum, but the precedent is basically working with the director, Julie Decker, again, and you're getting the impression that the questions that I raised are why Julie Decker, why not Seth Cantor or some other writer, in terms of the Anchorage Museum doing this big co-publishing deal. It looks like it's something that's creating a back channel financially for either Julia O'Malley or Julie Decker, potentially. I don't know the details, but I've asked for the details, in terms of getting funds, which is obviously from the publication of that book, for-profit funds for themselves, beyond just like the notoriety of publishing the book and all the things that come from that. But again, we're circling back, focusing on the fact that it doesn't really open the opportunity to other writers. This is something there's no policy and metric to support why Julie Decker or why Julia O'Malley. So that's really sort of a problem because, again, conflicting with the nonprofit status, misappropriation of funds concerns are raised, but then also just unethical and corruption. They're basically leveraging their position within the nonprofit or within the sphere there for personal gain in terms of Julie Decker. Now, the other thing that I wanted to raise, and I mentioned just last night, is that, looking at it beyond misappropriation of funds, beyond the for-profit and nonprofit conflicts, there's just sort of almost like an incestuous relationship and a problem when we have the nonprofit, the Anchorage Museum, join so closely with this sort of undisclosed partnership with the Anchorage Daily News, the for-profit business. For instance, Zachary Hughes, who is a reporter who used to work for AK Public News in Alaska, works over there at ADN now. His wife's on the board of directors of the museum. He's going to be guaranteed a position over there. You know what I mean? Because as long as that museum, where his wife's on the board of directors, is funneling money into that from that nonprofit into the for-profit newspaper. You know what I mean? So it becomes something where it's really corrupt. Is the only word we can use to describe it at this point. And sort of in conclusion here, you know what I mean, sort of circling back toward my initial letter that I sent to Anchorage Daily News before I really focused on the museum thing, where I just sort of asked the question about the museum and the partnership with Julia O'Malley, specifically focused on the social media actions of the employees of Anchorage Daily News, like Nat Hurst, like David Tweeland, and like Julia O'Malley, in terms of being very political, overtly political and very partisan, and how basically the Anchorage Daily News doesn't have any sort of employee ever that's conservative in any shape or form. And then, expanding that observation and that analysis, in terms of how the nonprofit is partnering with a for-profit, and the for-profit is basically, partisan and political in a newspaper. We're also looking at ProPublica, and we're noticing that I don't know any ProPublica employee that is conservative either. You know what I mean? So it becomes something when we look at like the IRS and like the laws that govern nonprofits. Basically these nonprofits are doing this funny thing where they're funneling this money into a for-profit newspaper, and the for-profit newspaper, before they even funnel the money, the for-profit newspaper is very liberal and very overtly political. But then when we're looking at the social media activity of the nonprofits that are giving the money to the for-profit newspaper, but also all of the for-profit employees, we can see that they're using this nonprofit money that should not be legally used for against political candidates. For instance, like focusing on Julia O'Malley, a lot of the other people in Anchorage working for the ADN, they are very loud and vocal on social media. That their profiles say that they work for ADN, but they're against the current conservative Mayor Bronson, or they're against Mike Dunleavy, the current governor. And again, they're using those social media accounts that are now, some of them, like Julia O'Malley, for instance, funded by these nonprofit dollars. And these nonprofit dollars are not supposed to be funding the political activity, but the social media accounts are being used by the employees of the for-profit, but getting money from the nonprofit specifically for that employee's salary for activity political against, speaking out against a specific candidate in a certain race or in a certain governance position, which is unlawful. Anyway, and the last thing I wanted to remark on, I did some research and I was really trying to find it out for myself. Is this sort of a realistic partnership for nonprofits in this day and age, specifically in the sphere of journalism, to be funneling money sort of in a reverse engineered way to a for-profit newspaper? Because typically for-profits give money to nonprofits for philanthropic things, not the other way around, which is what we're finding with this Anchorage Daily News and how they partnered with ProPublica. And ProPublica sort of set the bar, and I believe they're the ones who set the precedent in Alaska for this type of partnership, and the ones who the Anchorage Museum likely replicated when they did this thing with the Anchorage Daily News. In other words, they sort of copycatted that partnership with Kyle Hopkins, with the Unheard series, with ProPublica, Charles Ornstein, and that sort of thing. They won the Pulitzer or whatever for this stuff, and they're focusing on Native women in rural Alaska, and the law enforcement issues and the substance abuse issues and yada yada yada. Anyway, domestic violence and that sort of thing, and violence and lack of police, etc. etc. And some of that stuff, I sort of challenged when it happened, so I was very aware that it was going when he's talking about the police and the burbs. But what I found was, like for instance, Salt Lake City, they've got a big newspaper there, and the newspaper there changed the way that they're incorporated, and they became a nonprofit newspaper, and they're transitioned into that so that they could actually more legally accept funds from, big foundations and that sort of thing. And another example was, in Seattle, I guess Seattle has a specific they established like a fund, like a nonprofit fund, to accept money from a nonprofit thing, to accept money from big charities, specifically to finance their investigatory, quote-unquote, journalism. Now, the issue with the Anchorage Museum is the Anchorage Museum is not, getting money specifically for doing journalism in Alaska. Or same thing with the Anchorage Daily News. They're not doing that. They're just almost laundering the money through the museum, the money that's going to the museum for other museum-related stuff. Because, it's fair to make the claim and challenge the museum on the fact that partnering with ADN and partnering with for-profit journalism, subscription-based journalists, when there's such a diversity of other, newspapers in Alaska that are challenging, competition, they're doing it without part. But it's basically, the way we were challenging the Anchorage Museum is out of the scope of the mission and purpose of their organization and what they accept donations and funds for. So, they can say, oh, well, it's operating costs, we can do whatever we want, but they really can't. There's a point where it doesn't really contribute in a streamlined, efficient, and easily communicated way towards the mission of their organization when they're doing this stuff, especially, obviously, financing Julia's book and how she's personally profiting from it, or financing Julie Decker's book, Julia O'Malley's book, but Julie Decker's book as well, and they're potentially personally profiting from those things, at the expense, which is just completely improper. But then also, it's just out of the scope and the mission and the purpose of the organization when they are doing this thing with the Neighbors series and with the Anchorage Daily News, and they're just basically picking up the tab on a salary of a journalist for a for-profit business. So I just want to quickly describe how I'm seeing this. So, like, say the soccer team or the gas station or, the the coffee business, is struggling, and they've got 5 different employees, and all of a sudden the local nonprofit is going to pick up the salary for one of those employees at the coffee business, at the soccer team, or at you know, the gas station or whatever, so that for $50,000-$60,000 a year, the for-profit business, coffee station, whatever, gas station or soccer team, no longer has to pay that coach, or no longer has to pay that employee. So that's a 50, whatever it is, X amount of money gain for that for-profit business. That is an extreme competitive advantage for them in terms of the way that they're structured. It's tax deductible. They're getting the money from an organization that got the money tax deductible, whereas the money should not. It's getting laundered back into a for-profit, taxable situation, which is the original people who had the money. You can't do that. It's illegal. Is basically what is my assessment, and that's not even talking about like the political activities on social media, etc. It's just illegal.